Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to today's eMobile online forum. My name is Can Güler. I'm product manager at IW Energie, and I will guide you through today's session. The eMobile online forum is organized jointly by IW Energie, ElectroSuisse, and Energie Schweiz. Today's 45-minute session will be held in English and includes Bessi's presentation, followed by question and discussion. Ich wechsle noch kurz auf Deutsch für alle, die das gerne mit Untertitel auf Deutsch verfolgen möchten. Sie können oben neben dem Kamerasymbol auf Weitere klicken. Dort finden Sie Sprache und Sprechen. Dann können Sie auf Live-Untertitel anzeigen klicken. Und dort finden Sie im Fenster, das unten auftaucht, einen Knopf Untertiteleinstellungen öffnen, wo Sie Ihre übersetzte oder Ihre Sprache anzeigen können. So sehen Sie auch alles, was gesprochen wird in Ihrer Muttersprache. This event is being recorded. Please post your questions in the Microsoft Teams chat and give a thumbs up to questions you find particularly relevant. Afterwards, we will send you the presentation, the recording, and a short feedback survey. Today's topic is: how should we pay for roads in an electric future? Taxes on petrol and diesel currently make an important contribution to finance our roads. As transport becomes electric, these revenues will decline. The question is how to replace them fairly and reliably without slowing down the transition to electric mobility. Possible models include taxes on electric vehicle and distance-based road charges. Each involves trade-offs for public revenues, vehicle adoption, and fairness. Today, we will see how data and modeling can help us to assess these options. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Bessi Noll as today's speaker. Bessi is a senior researcher in the Energy and Technology Policy Group at ETH Zurich, where she also teaches. Her research focuses on public policy and the energy transition, particularly low-carbon transport and clean energy markets. She holds bachelor's and master's degrees from the Stanford University and completed her PhD at the ETH Zurich in 2023. Earlier this year, she received the 2026 Young Researcher Award from the International Transport Forum at the OECD. Her work on electric vehicle taxation, public revenues, and vehicle adoption makes her ideally placed to guide us through today's topic. Bessi, thank you very much for joining us. We are delighted to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Gian, thanks for the invite. Thank you to you all for sharing your lunch with me. I will share my screen here so we can follow along together. Let me know when the content is visible. I think we're good.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to present a bit of our work on this topic of taxing electric vehicles and the shifting landscape of public revenues in the age of EVs. So really looking at data, a bit of some of the modeling work that we've been doing over the past 3 years, as well as policy options and trade-offs. So in terms of who we are, I thought I would start with a bit of an opening slide to tell you a bit about the Energy and Technology Policy Group. So we are one professorship at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at ETH. We are led by Professor Tobias Schmidt, as well as closely with Bjarne Steffen, Prof. Bjarne Steffen. And Toby, he has been sort of the main driver behind the Einstein School of Public Policy, is also the inaugural director there, which some of you may have heard of. This started back in November of 2025. And what do we do here? We're kind of a mix, interdisciplinary mix of economists, social scientists, political scientists, and engineers. And we primarily work on these 3 topics. So public policy and technological change, finance is a key element of technological change, particularly in countries in the global south. And then finally, politics and policy change. And this really covers a number of topics in the energy space, some of which I've listed here. My work has really very much focused on the low carbon transport transition, which is what we will cover today in a relatively short agenda. So I'll take you through a bit of the background and motivation for a couple of the studies that we did on this topic. I will go into a bit more detail on Switzerland's journey to an EV tax, primarily because they are actually leaders in this space, and there's quite a bit of development in terms of policy recourse and policy action and planning. So we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. I'll introduce the study that we published back in 2024 on managing EV taxation and adoption. I'll go into the results and then conclude a bit with thoughts and key takeaways. So a few years ago, when I started this presentation, back when the study was kind of in the middle of its course, the title of this slide was actually "The EV Transition is Nearly Here," which I had to update. It's not here, it's well underway. And if you're familiar at all with the International Energy Agency's World EV Outlook report, they came out with the 2026 report just recently at the beginning of June, stated that in around 40 countries, electric cars are now accounting for more than 10% of new cars sold. Obviously, in more leading countries like Norway, China, interestingly, Nepal, Iceland, Vietnam, and Thailand in Southeast Asia, as well a bit Singapore, right? These are some of the larger numbers in terms of total vehicle sales that are truly battery electric. So we're rapidly moving towards a higher share of electric vehicles, but we could be moving even faster, right? And there's still definitely this upward track of the S-curve that we're trying to get to in the end, which means in turn that public transport revenues are steadily declining. And this is for a number of reasons. So one, obviously, as you switch to EVs and most of the on-road stock fleet is not paying fuel tax, you have a diminishing revenue, which is what we'll focus on today. But there's a number of other reasons too, right? So we've had decreasing gas car efficiency. So over the years, revenues have been steadily declining as combustion engine cars become more efficient, as well as sort of this idea of an unadjusted fuel tax rate. I think the best example there is the United States, which has a national level fuel tax. The US has some of the lowest fuel tax rates in the world, but at the national level, this fuel tax has been the same since 1993. So we're having a bit of an issue in terms of unadjusted rates as costs to maintain roads increase. So what do we do about this? Who is addressing this? It's actually a well-discussed topic, and there are a number of countries that are sort of deliberating and deciding and trying to understand what do we do about this? How do we best fill these decreasing revenues? Does it make sense to tax EVs outright? In what way? Should we do this slowly, right? Like, what's the best tax option? So Japan is certainly weighing this fear of revenue decline. Obviously, Norway is having their own sort of, I think Norway is above 90% of new sales are EVs now. They're having to think about this tax question. Switzerland, certainly. Australia and New Zealand have had a distance-based road charge in place for a number of years now, but they're playing around with different sort of policy designs in terms of the height of the tax. This is a huge topic in the US. There are about 10 states or so that are piloting projects for taxing EVs preemptively. So certainly a discussion piece, but as far as we've seen, there's no sort of convergence on which policy design is most effective. And so that's sort of what we're looking at moving forward. Then I would turn a bit also to this, or stay a bit in this global EV transition space before moving to Switzerland. We did a study, actually it came out earlier this year in January, which tried to say, what is the revenue at stake? What is the actual total revenue gap? If you sort of add up all of the countries in the world that tax fuel as it enters the car, and what does that look like across income level? And what we found is actually, first and foremost, the revenue gap is really quite large. So we did this study for the year 2023, even though I'm showing 2024 absolute US dollars. we found about a 923 billion US dollar revenue gap. This is tremendous, right? Most of the revenue gap is situated in high income countries, as you can see the dark green on the left sort of figure here. But if you think about this total revenue gap in terms of what percentage of these fuel tax revenues are sort of exposing total government revenues, then you run into a bit of a different situation where actually lower middle income and low income countries are disproportionately exposed. And so this was our second finding, if you look at the figure on the right here, that as you move towards a lower income country, fuel tax revenues could represent on average close to 12% of total government revenues, which causes problems, right? If you're rapidly transitioning to EVs, and you might not have the sufficient administrative capacity to switch the way that you collect taxes and pay for the roads ultimately. So this is a huge problem. This was the first time that any sort of global level data had been published for sort of the scoping of revenue gaps. I would turn then to Switzerland's journey to an EV tax. I'm sure that some of you are likely familiar with this, as it's made headlines in Switzerland, and actually the process of changing the constitution is well underway. So financing for Switzerland's transport infrastructure looks a bit like this. 80% of the infrastructure financing comes from mineral oil taxes alone. There's two types of mineral oil tax. You pay around 76 Rappen per liter at the pump. Part of this is from the mineral oil tax, which is contributing about 60% of the total. And then mineral oil tax surcharge is the second piece. And those taxes sort of run directly into two funds. So you have the Finanzierung der Strassenverkehr and the other NEF, Nationalstraßen und Agglomerationsverkehrsfonds, bear with me there. And these are the bulk, right? You can see it's almost 4.5 million franc that are funding the roads. And the question then is, how does Switzerland sort of project these funds to decrease? There's actually been quite a bit of research into this, particularly from the ASTRA office, Federal Office of Roads. And ASTRA projects the financial outlook for Switzerland to look like this. So by 2030, which is this red line that I've shown, roughly 75% of today's revenues will be available, meaning we're losing about 25%. And as you project further out to 2050, right, trying to meet Switzerland's targets for decarbonizing the transport sector, these revenues are continuing to decline. So this is a serious issue. The question of, how quickly this decline happens and whether or not that curve is quite what it looks like, always up to debate, but the general trend is there. We need to replace these revenues from a fuel tax with something else. Most probably, with an EV tax. So at the moment, ASTRA has proposed two solutions for EV taxing. And this would actually force a constitutional amendment. So it's quite a bit of a process in terms of political steps. And there have been a couple of preliminary drafts for what the options could be. So one would be a distance-based tax. So you would pay Rappen per kilometer that you travel over the year on Swiss roads specifically. And they would also factor in there, if you're interested, sort of a bit of this weighting factor, right? EVs tend to be a bit heavier. If you have a heavier EV, you should pay more for the roads, kind of this user pays principle. So that would be option one, you pay per kilometer. And option two would be you pay as you charge electricity, which looks very similar to the paying of the gas tax at the pump. The difference there with electricity charging is there's a number of more options we have as EV owners to charge. You can charge publicly at a station. You can charge privately at home. You can charge privately at home with electricity that you generate by yourself, right? So there's different sort of constellations of what the tax could be or should be and how you actually administer this tax in terms of the technical setup. So at the moment, for the distance-based tax, there's two options that have been proposed. One would be you self-declare at the end of the year, and you submit, as you would your taxes, the total kilometer or odometer reading on your car, and that would be sort of a self-declaration. The other somewhat simpler option, if you're not so worried about tracking, would be to have a sort of federally verified distance tracking device in your car that just does this automatically. You don't have to worry about anything. It submits automatically to sort of the Federal Roads Office, which calculates your tax. The second option, where you're charging with electricity, would be a little bit more involved. Basically, they're saying every point of charge that an EV would have, or option that the EV would have, would need to be retrofitted or provisionally fitted with a tax system. And this would take quite a bit of time. So they're deciding right now about what this would look like in terms of when you would expect every charging system to have this technical tax calculator. And in the meantime, they would sort of charge a flat rate of around 23 per kilowatt hour. So this is still being sort of deliberated at the moment, but those are the two options you would have. And in terms of timeline, right now so both of these options have been submitted to sort of the deliberation process. That's right now between, I think this was last year in November. So they're still deliberating. We're in the middle of 2026. There will actually be a vote on this planned for the end of 2028. So Swiss citizens will have to vote on whether or not to tax EVs, as it is a change to the constitution. And then tentatively by the end of 2029, early 2030, you would have this policy entered into force. Ideally, a little bit before that, you're setting up and establishing the tax systems, depending on what's decided in terms of the equipment, right? So this is a bit of the timeline, which I thought could be interesting to share. If you're looking for more facts, numbers, or reasoning, Astra has a really great website that you can follow here. The slides I'll share with you after the presentation, and they go into more detail on what these two proposals would look like. But just a bit of a short overview for you in terms of Switzerland's journey. But I would move then into our study, which moves beyond Switzerland and compares a couple of countries, 5 actually. It was published in Cell Report Sustainability back in 2024, called Managing Trade-offs Between Electric Vehicle Taxation and Adoption, and is essentially trying to ask this question of how can policymakers design effective tax policies that balance two needs, right? You have on the one hand this need to recover revenues and pay for your roads, and this other need that we, hopefully would all agree on is this acceleration towards EV adoption and more EVs on the road. And these are two competing policy priorities. So how do you do this effectively? What are the key things to think about? This is a bit what the study had in mind. And we came up with a framework. It's a 2-part framework for taxing EVs under competing policy objectives. And the first part is really just about understanding and evaluating your taxation options, which for those of you who own a car, this is probably not new at all. I do not own a car, so some of this was new for me when we got into it. But we broadly categorize into 3 taxation types. So you have an acquisition tax. This would be something like a tax at registration when you first purchase the car. Sales tax or VAT, very typical. You might have an environmental tax that a government would levy on the import of the vehicle. Import tax, luxury tax, right? These are one-time costs that would be charged upfront at the purchase. Then in our second category, we would have the ownership tax. And this is something more charged on an annual basis. It could be something like a periodic inspection fee. You might have an insurance tax, which is also part of the ownership sort of category. You could even have a weight tax, right? Depending on how the setup is situated. But this is something that would be charged maybe once a year, could even be quarterly or bi-yearly. And the last one is then a usage tax. And this would be your typical fuel tax or excise duties, is what most or all cars pay on the roads. Combustion engine cars pay on the roads today. It could be an electricity tax, right? What we discussed. It could also be a road tax. We have tolls in Switzerland. They're not very expensive, but other countries have different kinds of tolls or vignettes that might actually cost more and even disincentivize certain drivers from taking the roads. Or maybe a license tax, right? So you have different taxation types. And we wanted to understand, how do you evaluate these different types along which dimensions? And we came up with three, right? So why would I choose an acquisition over a usage versus an ownership? And really, there's three dimensions here. One is the rationale, right? So why do we tax at all? And really there, the reason is quite clear. You need to finance the roads. It's a public infrastructure. It's a public good. This is the government's role to tax and distribute funds and spend funds accordingly. That would be maybe the primary reason. But the second reason would be internalizing negative externalities, right? And this would be more related to what we see when we have polluting cars that have specific negative externalities that we don't always price in, right, to the tax or the cost, but should be there in theory. So this is a bit the rationale. And then the implementation. How easy is it to tax this? How much administrative capacity does it take? Is it politically implementable, right? Is this vote that's planned for the end of 2028 in Switzerland likely to pass? Do we think that Swiss voters would support a tax on EVs? This is certainly another consideration. And then the final dimension would be side effects. And here we're thinking more fairness and equity. If I choose to only tax people upfront in an acquisition style, what does that mean for low-income earners versus middle versus high-income earners that may not have equal access to liquidity to finance? So we have these dimensions. And then the second part of the framework is really understanding country-specific revenue exposure. And here we look at a couple things. So first, what is the current taxation structure? How are you taxing across these types? And then the second one is projected EV transition speed. Are you a country that's accelerating towards EV adoption, maybe Norway, or are you a country that's lagging quite far behind for whatever reason? The example that I'll bring today is Japan. But the projected EV transition speed certainly affects how you should design your policy, and I'll get into a little bit of what that means. In terms of case selection, we have 5 countries that we picked. There are a number of different transition speeds from countries around the world that are looking to go electric. This is from Bloomberg NEF, which is one of the most trusted sources in terms of looking at EV adoption across countries. And here we decided to really look at these countries sort of in the middle section of the adoption trajectory. So we're right, so this sort of gray section here. We're not looking at outliers. We're not quite looking at Norway, and we're not looking at, maybe some of the lower income countries in the global south, Malawi, Uganda, right? Like this is sort of the lower end of the transition that we will also not look at. So we're really sort of focusing in the middle. And then we tried to pick countries that have a bit of a variation in terms of how they tax cars. So the countries we picked in the end are really their jurisdictions, unless you want to think of California as its own state, but California, Denmark, Germany, Japan, and Switzerland. And I really like this plot because it shows that no one country really taxes cars in the same way. It's very different, both in terms of absolute height. So on the top in the gray bars here, you're seeing how many, what the charge is per 1,000 vehicle kilometers traveled. In terms of a tax. And California, I mean, most states in the US are barely taxing at all, versus Japan taxes heavily to use the roads. It, in fact, is disincentivizing users to drive, which maybe makes sense why their public transport is so strong. Denmark's also sort of on the higher end. Germany's maybe somewhere in the middle. Switzerland, rather low, right? Low toll, fuel taxes, not super high. But as you can see in Switzerland, even though it's a low absolute tax, the fuel tax makes up quite a large percentage of the total that is taxed. So if you take this away, there's quite a gap. And this looks differently across the different countries, right? So Japan, very high absolute tax, but the fuel tax is not what's contributing to that. It's really tolls. They have very expensive tolls. So how do you make sense of this? How do you sort of look across these 5 very different countries in terms of tax structure and in terms of adoption speed or projected adoption speed to sort of give advice to policymakers? What we do at EPG is model, and this is very typical for ex-ante policy design, policy making. You model how you think a transition might play out or how the projection might look. And then you say, okay, if this is my baseline, what are my different policy interventions for whatever outcome or goal I might have? So what we did in this study is a techno-economic adoption model where we selected two technologies, right? You can either buy a combustion engine vehicle or a battery electric vehicle. And we model over time, in this case through 2030, I believe, 2035, based on total cost of ownership of passenger vehicles, right? So this includes everything from the CapEx of the vehicle, operating expenditures, financing costs, and it's all sort of averaged over how much you drive over the lifetime of the vehicle, including detailed tax components, right? We sort of project how these different costs will look into the future, and we do endogenize what's called the switching cost, which I will not get into now. If you're interested, I'm happy to answer questions about this. But think of the switching cost as an additional cost that a user might have to move from a combustion engine vehicle to a battery electric vehicle. I'm worried about charging station availability. I'm worried about range, right? This is going to inhibit me from making this switch. Then lastly, we intervene with different policies and we look at what they do, right? So the first step is to have sort of a baseline market share projection here. Okay, so we're modeling from 2020 through 2035. And we look at those. And then we intervene with different types of policy for full revenue recovery. And I'll explain what that means. So there are different, considerations that you could model in terms of revenue recovery. Here, we're assuming full revenue recovery. So we're imposing a tax on electric vehicles, equivalent to the fuel tax or excise duty charged for gas vehicles, ICE, over the lifetime of the vehicle. So it should sort of match out, right, in this case. The different intervention types, as we discussed earlier, you could do it with an acquisition charge, an annual charge, a distance-based charge, and then you could have different timings, right? So in 2025 is the model start point where I intervene, or where we intervene. The instantaneous timing would be right at 2025, we go up to full revenue recovery and slap on a tax. The other would be a phased in with overshoot option. And this is the purple line you're seeing off to the right in the plot. And there you might start with a lower tax initially and then overshoot as you move past 2030 into 2035 in order to get this full recovery, right? The idea being maybe let's tax less now, tax later more when the transition is a bit evolved. So we looked at these options and we tried to understand how does this impact the transition. So I'll move now to the results, and I won't show you all of them, but I'll show you maybe enough that you can get an idea. But first, I would start with the baseline projection. So here, this is the main outcome of the study. What I'm showing on the y-axis here is the market share of new vehicle sales that are only battery electric. And then on the x-axis, we're moving in time out through 2035. And here you can see that Denmark and California are projected leaders in terms of EV adoption, reaching, upwards of 80% by 2030. Germany and Switzerland are somewhere in the middle, and Japan is noticeably lagging. Now, we did this modeling back in, actually, it was like early 2023. So I updated a bit and tried to see where we are. It's 2026 today. How good did we do? Denmark almost spot on. Japan is noticeably lower. So Japan has a very, very low EV adoption rate. It's less than 3% at the moment. So our projections, which were low, at least what we thought would be low, are too high in this case. And Germany, I think we sort of overprojected a bit. Switzerland, not so far off, right? So we're about 22% of new vehicle sales in Switzerland right now are fully battery electric. And Germany is maybe a bit off as well as California. So hard to project. This is what I show this just to say that it's difficult to project. But what we do say in this study is it's less about the absolute baseline projections and much more about the relative impact of the policy that we apply to these. So that's what I would show you then now, right? What are the intervention effects on the EV transition? And I'll sort of juxtapose two countries here, California, which we know has a much faster transition to EVs at a baseline, and Switzerland, which is somewhere in the middle. And what we're looking at here are two, right? So in the orange is looking at the acquisition tax, And the blue is the annual or distance-based charge. And then the top row is sort of an instantaneous policy intervention, and the bottom is phased in. What we can see most sort of explicitly is that taxing EVs can absolutely kill the transition, right? In every case that we intervene with the policy, you see a lower uptake of percentage-wise EV adoption. That would be the main finding. The second finding would be that an acquisition charge fares worse than an annual or distance-based charge, which is sort of an interesting finding there. And we'll talk a little bit more about why. But the third piece here would be instantaneous versus phased in. What does this look like? What's better or what's worse? And the answer is it depends, right? So for a phased in tax, this places an additional cost burden on BEVs at a later future stage when electric vehicles have sort of naturally become more competitive. You're sort of hurting them more in that sense, penalizing. And you can see that very clearly. Let's look at the bottom right plot for Switzerland. This blue line sort of starts, pedaling along under the baseline. And then after 2030, it sort of ramps out sort of in a negative direction. And this is where you can see this overshoot piece of the policy design really hindering EV adoption. So it's a bit of a competing effect here, and it depends very much on, where does this delayed higher tax burden fall within the tipping point? And it's hard to understand where a tipping point comes, right? Like, I think this is probably the most important piece that a policymaker could have is when is the economics of EVs favorable? And if you know that point, you can kind of sort of infer backwards a bit which policy design makes more or less sense. And what we did here then is, just to give you a bit of a different look, we defined what's called a policy effect, which is to say, what is the area between the baseline and the intervention over the period of intervention? Right, so how much are you annually increasing or decreasing the EV share as compared to the baseline? And we looked then across all 5 jurisdictions to see what are the different policy effects in a bit more detail. You can see them all together on one slide here. And again, California and Denmark, much less affected. So California is transitioning much faster to EVs. In this case, we find with a fast transition and a relatively low exposure, it doesn't really matter what you tax or how you tax it in terms of timing. It just won't do much to the economics. A little bit, right? But not significantly less than what we're seeing in Switzerland and Germany, where you might see a drop in 50% of new EV sales because of this one tax that you're implementing. So for California, this is sort of a different case. Denmark has a very high fuel tax. So despite being, a faster transitioning country, as we saw on the previous slide, the fuel tax itself, in terms of absolute tax, is quite high. And this is kind of what's driving a bit of this in sort of, certainly in the acquisition part, roughly 40% decrease in EV fuel sales or EV sales annually as compared to 20% here on the distance-based tax intervention. And then for these slower lagging countries, it depends a bit. But by and large, what we're seeing is that the instantaneous tax timing appears slightly better in most cases if you're looking at Germany, Japan, and Switzerland, though this is largely within a margin of error. So I would say it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of what you should pick. On the last slide, I'll sort of summarize what I think are the key pieces that policymakers should keep in mind. But at least this gives a bit of a picture of how it plays out differently. I'm running out of time, but I have about 2 slides left. I'll hopefully finish up soon. So in terms of trade-offs, we did one final exercise, which is to say, okay, this is really a huge blow to the EV transition. If I put on a tax in Switzerland at 100% revenue recovery, and the policy effect is, 50% lower EV sales per year. So we did a bit of an exercise to say, okay, maybe for these countries where it's really hurting the transition, you might want to think about lower levels of revenue recovery, at least until the transition can get underway. And certainly for California, you can see doesn't really matter, right? 100% revenue recovery versus 40%, you're within a margin of 5% error in terms of what it would do to diminishing the transition. But for Switzerland, Germany, and Japan, this is quite a steep slope. So for these countries, for policymakers in these countries, it might make sense to think about starting with a lower sort of overall revenue recovery goal before sort of ramping it up. So we did a bit of a look there. Okay, I will finish quickly with sort of concluding thoughts and takeaways. In terms of the results, maybe 3 points. So taxing EVs, I think outright, your biggest takeaway is they can have a dramatic delaying effect on the transition. So we need to be smart about how we design these policies and how we time them. The effect size can vary depending on vehicle taxation structures, as well as the projected transition speed, right? And most notably here, we found that annual and distance-based taxes fare better than acquisition tax, which really shifts the financial burden to the front of the payment cycle. And that's a bit regressive in that sense, particularly for low-income earners. Finally, under full revenue recovery, jurisdictions transitioning slower would fare better under an instantaneous taxation. This is a bit of this weird effect that we found in the results. Then I would say, one of the things we do try to write about in this paper is that theoretically, the distance-based tax is the best option. It's highly flexible. It can promote sort of this reduced road usage. It best accounts for externalities that might vary with location, things like air pollution, things like congestion, or even noise. And it's very much in line with the user pays principle. So if you were to sort of, if you have any political sway, as particularly in the Swiss system, as we move towards the vote in 2028, we would very much sort of suggest the distance-based tax is the better option and more equitable, less regressive option. Yeah. Then finally, I would finish in terms of like important takeaways for policymakers. One, have a sense of your transition speed. You need to know how quickly your sort of region is transitioning to EVs to make an informed decision on the tax itself. And then finally, start the conversation now. I showed a few countries that are starting to talk about it, but by and large, most of the countries that are already transitioning to EVs have not thought about how to administer a different tax. Revenues are declining. This is a serious concern in terms of public budget. So start early and familiarize yourself with the conversation. Thank you so much. I will stop there a little bit over time, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have and even stay a bit later if there are a lot of questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Bessie, for this fascinating presentation and for giving us such a clear picture of the different trade-offs involved. We have still some minutes for the questions and discussion. Please continue to submit your questions in the Teams chat. You all can also give a thumbs up to the questions that are particularly relevant for you. Bessie, I would like to begin with the first question. Have you assessed a vehicle-based approach in which the tax is based on the amount of energy charged into vehicles, measured either by a calibrated onboard meter or potentially through standardized vehicle data, such as OBFCM? Would such an approach compare with the two options currently proposed in Switzerland in terms of fairness, data protection, technical feasibility, and administrative complexity?
So I'm not familiar with this specific acronym that was brought up in the question, but just maybe to make sure I understand the question, you're asking, so have I assessed an electricity tax in the context of sort of these modeling projections? I think that's what they're going for.
The difference is, I think, that this OBFCM is the onboard fuel consumption monitoring. So the data is not coming from outside of the vehicle. So it's provided by the vehicle. Yeah. This is the thing. But yeah, I also see some problems there I mean, standardize this.
So the easy answer is no, we did not look into this. But I think what I could say is, in terms, there's maybe some questions as to, how safe and secure users would feel about different devices in their car, right? And I've had many discussions with people about this over the years who are more or less adamant about, freedom to drive without being tracked. But I think in terms of policy effect, I would put that situation very much in this user-based distance charge approach. So you could think of it as being a similar outcome in terms of how such a charge would have an effect on adoption rates. But yeah, certainly, I think there are questions remaining about the sort of the safety and privacy aspect. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. We will continue with the next. Were any further measures, such as the introduction of an ETS2 for road transport, taken into account when determining the baseline?
No, we do not. So the ETS2 is not included in this, primarily because at the time, transport was not included in this, in sort of the ETS, European ETS system. I know that Switzerland has their own, and California is also debating, but no, we excluded this entirely. It could be an interesting competing policy to look at a bit in terms of, how would that additionally penalize ICE vehicles or gas vehicles? This is not something we did, right? So the options that you have to recover revenues are, one, just tax EVs at the same rate as you would tax ICE vehicles, but the other would be to tax gas vehicles more, right, and penalize them further, which is certainly what Norway is doing. I think if you look closely at the transition in Norway, and what is often a misconception there, that, they just got rid of all taxes for EVs. They didn't even really subsidize, they just eliminated taxes and fees. But on top of that, they put a pretty hefty tax on gas cars, conventional cars. You're just taxing out the alternative. So I do think, yeah, we discussed whether or not that would be interesting to look at. Ultimately, in the end, I think we wanted to keep it clean and simple and say, politically, that's very difficult to implement, right? Like voting on an additional tax for ICE vehicles would be rather unpopular in most of the jurisdictions we looked at. So let's keep it in an even playing field and just try to bring the EV tax up to what the equivalent would be for the gas cars. But yeah, you could certainly redo the study with that tax in there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think this answers already the next questions. Did the study consider a transitional approach that avoids overshooting EV taxation by temporarily increasing taxes on internal combustion engine vehicles to offset the loss in the tax revenues? And maybe you answered the question, I think, already. But what do you think about this approach?
I mean, so I think it's worked very well in certain regions. So like Norway is obviously the shining example there. I think in theory, this is what policymakers would love to be able to do, right? You have a stick on one hand and you have sort of a carrot on the other. And it sort of creates this perfect S transition to whatever it is that you're hoping to achieve. In reality, this is a lot less straightforward and it's a lot messier. So I think, a lot of my research recently has been delving into the EV transition in the global south. There you have a totally different scenario in terms of what users can afford for driving when they get in their car. And there, in that sense, it could be incredibly unfair to sort of just increase either the fuel tax or an additional annual environmental tax on gas cars. Not everyone can afford this, right? So it depends a bit also on the function of the user base. And then you can kind of sort of move into this discussion of regressive taxes. Ideally, in sort of low-income environments, you would start with exemptions for the new technology that you're trying to aim for, as opposed to higher taxes. Norway, rather high-income country, for them it worked, right? I just think there's more nuance to it than let's tax heavily gas cars and sort of exempt fees for EVs. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we continue. Is there also a policy discussion about where the entire revenue gap actually needs to be replaced, while sufficient funding is clearly required to maintain the existing road network? Could Declining revenues also lead to a reassessment of how much should we be invested in expanding road capacity and building new roads.
Yes, absolutely. This is something that we got quite a few comments on as I've presented this over the last couple of years. So the US is the famous example of their budget for road maintenance and even expansion, sort of infrastructure expansion, has been dwindling for the last 30 years. So even if we meet this revenue recovery gap exactly as we have in this sort of idealized model, that's not enough, right? There's still an additional gap that's not being calculated sufficiently, also partly contributed from this sort of constant road tax that hasn't been changed since 93 or 96. So certainly, I think you could imagine scenarios where you are increasing the revenue recovery beyond what is currently being collected. It depends a bit, though. As far as I have seen, so Switzerland is doing a rather good job. I think, not so far off in terms of what is needed to maintain the roads and what is being collected. Germany, I would also put into this bucket. But certainly in other countries or other parts of the world, this is not the case. So then you would have to think about, expanding the charge even further. Mind you, depending on the tax structure, not every country feeds, the budget that's required or available for road maintenance is maybe fed in by multiple sources. Most probably or most heavily from the fuel tax, but it could be sort of a general budget that feeds into this pool as well. So it depends, right? But I do think that would be a consideration worth considering, or sort of modeling, and something we would like to look at in the future as well. Mm-hmm.
Very good. Continue with the next question. How would foreign vehicles transitioning Switzerland be treated under a Swiss-specific road charging system? And are there any initiative to harmonize such system at the European level or potentially even globally? You all have shown us the different countries with the different tax models to ensure interoperability to avoid multiple national solutions.
Yeah, this is a great question. The short answer is no. I have seen very little effort to sort of harmonize the way that we tax, certainly even in the EU, where you have sort of free and open roads, and it would make sense to harmonize the way that we tax vehicles across countries. There's been some effort with this, I think, in certain countries in sort of northwestern Europe that have a similar toll or vignette service that applies to, I want to say Germany, Denmark, or maybe Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, maybe even Sweden, right? Depending on the car type. This also applies to lorries, right? But beyond that, no. And the problem then is every country has its own system of taxation and it's funding into its own budgets. I would think a harmonized system would make a lot of sense, particularly as you rent a car in Paris and you're driving to the southern tip of Portugal, right? Like, which roads am I driving on? Which budgets do that fall into? I think it's just administratively and politically very difficult to do this. And I've hosted a couple of roundtable discussions on this topic with different legislators from Switzerland, Austria, and Germany in particular, and then also a few sort of researchers from the OECD that are looking at this. And they told me the same thing, right? I think they've been pushing this for many years, and it's just really met with a lot of administrative difficulty. But it makes so much sense, right? I mean, even here, right? So a lot of Swiss drivers drive primarily in Switzerland, yes, but then are crossing, into Austria, into France and Italy throughout the year. Are you tracking this odometer reading and submitting it every year to the end, to Astra in terms of your voluntary reading? How does this work in terms of tracking and privacy? So yeah, I do think a harmonized system would make a lot of sense. We probably won't see it, but yeah.
Yeah, would be great. But yeah, the other question going also on this topic is, could road charges be geographically differentiated to reflect where external costs actually occur? For example, higher charges for noise, congestion, and tire pollution in city centers or environmentally sensitive areas? And would such a model be technically and politically feasible without creating disproportionate privacy and administrative concerns?
Yeah, I mean, this is really why we would push for this distance-based tax. It's just most flexible. So you could, this question is spot on, right? You can really differentiate even the fee itself, the height of the tax, depending on where specifically you're driving geographically, maybe the time of day. If I drive my car into the city of Zurich between the hours of 4 and 6 p.m., should I be taxed more to sort of avoid congestion, right? This is certainly an option. And it's so the flexibility of that tax option is really tremendous in that sense, which, yeah, in terms of political feasibility, who knows? I'm curious to see how this will play out now with these two options that have really been proposed for the Swiss case. Very right. So technically speaking, you would need sort of a tracker in the car if you wanted a more detailed assessment of where the car is and then accordingly how you would tax. But the privacy concerns are there. So if that's voted down, obviously you can't do that. You can't really, if I'm submitting odometer readings, that doesn't work in terms of taxing for regions that are more congested, potentially polluting more, right? So I would hope that that's the sort of the system that we move to, and then you can be much more flexible in that sense. And you can also be a bit more progressive and fair in terms of maybe, lower income users could have sort of a lower tax bracket in that sense for where they're driving. Yeah, let's see how it plays out though.
Yeah, let's take a look in the other option with the kilowatt per hour charge. How would the proposed charging electricity tax treat bidirectional charging? For example, if locally generated PV electricity is charged into an EV vehicle and later discharged to supply their home, would the tax be refunded? So that only energy actually used for driven taxes and so on. So you can imagine.
Yeah, great question. I don't know. So from what they've written, publicly posted, this is not discussed. In theory, yes, the tax should absolutely be returned. But I would assume if you install a system in your home charging unit that can manage sort of tax flows, it's monitoring electrons one way or the other, and then you slap a rate on that. So which in theory, that should work. It's feasible technically. But at the moment, I haven't heard about this being discussed, but yeah, certainly that's a consideration, particularly for people who are, generating their own electricity or even storing and using their car battery as sort of home power. Yeah.
I think we're running out of questions. The time is it's already over, but I will finish it with an interesting question. I think, what assumptions does your model make about the future total cost of ownership of battery electric and internal combustion engine vehicles? If battery electric vehicles reach the purchase price parity with the internal combustion vehicles, or even become cheaper to purchase, how would this affect your results, particularly regarding the EV adoption and the appropriate timing and level of taxation?
Yeah, this is, spot on. So we use Bloomberg data, and we sort of coordinate with a few other sources to make sure we're roughly on the right track. But I would say that the numbers that we used back in 2023 are already outdated. So battery electric vehicles, the cost of the vehicle itself, just the CapEx, has already undercut combustion engine vehicles in a lot of markets. Certainly in China, right? And I would say in Norway as well. But essentially what it would do is shift these baseline plots to the left, and everything is accelerated a bit faster. In theory, right? There might be some country holdouts that are just unwilling to support EVs. They're really looking to sort of hold on to even their hybrid structure, or maybe their fuel cell electric vehicles. I'm thinking about Japan in this case. So there are other political considerations that might not see this shift left, but by and large, you shift these plots left, and then most of the case countries would be in this category of, I'm a fast adopter. You know, if I start a tax earlier or later in that transition, how do I understand what that means in terms of what the diminishing effect would look like? So again, you have to know how quickly you're moving. So if the projections for the cost of the EV are lower than what you would have expected, you need to account for this and adjust, because then the tax that you slap on in 2025 or 2027 might not have as much of an effect, which is great, right? In theory, that's what you would want. You need to recover revenues, but you want to maintain this S-shaped curve. So yeah, I think we're rather underestimating in that sense, and that the cost of EVs have just come down so much quicker than most people would have imagined. So maybe it will become less of a problem. It's just undercutting that much. Who knows?
Thank you very much, Bessie, and once again for your highly interesting presentation, for sharing your research with us, and of course for answering all our questions.
Yeah.
I would also like to thank you all for joining us today and for participating so actively in the discussion. As mentioned at the beginning, you will receive the presentation, the link to the recording, and a short feedback survey by email. We would be very grateful if you can take a moment to share your feedback with us. I hope you have a pleasant afternoon. I look forward to welcoming you again at our next immobile online forum. It will take place at the 19th of August. I will just show it in the screen. And it will be in German again. Yeah, so thank you very much. Have a pleasant afternoon. Thank you very much, Bessie. Thank you very much also to our partners, Elektrosys and Energie Schweiz. And of course, to you, all of the participants. Have a nice afternoon.
Thanks so much.